Righto, just a little bit of summation here for the previous 3 months, which doesn't include July to date. But clearly it was very dry through parts of southern WA, South Australia, Victoria, except with the exception of East Gippsland, but wetter up in some of the horticultural growing areas of southern Queensland, central Queensland, Bundaberg, and was that north central New South Wales. If we look at the rainfall to date for July, that is a very different map. We've now got greens over, so southwest WA has really picked up, as has South Australia, northern areas, Victoria, the north, Gippsland, wetter than they'd like to be, but really quite dry from, Werribee around to Geelong. That really has been missing out, roughly only about a third of their normal rainfall for July so far. But it's also been wetter in some of those other parts of southern Queensland and northern New South Wales as well. If we look at temperature, I really don't have any idea about how the temperature is going to be going for July, but we've got here the April, May, June, where it was decile 10 for maximum temperature over most of southeastern Australia. And interestingly enough, that was just a really scorching April and May, and June, the maximum temperatures were the first normal temperature month that we'd had for almost 12 months. All the others had been warmer than normal. Minimum temperatures have been, normal in some parts and warmer in others, but June and May, for that matter, were also cooler up here in the northwest in terms of minimum temperatures, and I'm thinking of almonds in the case of that as well, in terms of how they're moving along for their bud burst. Looking at stored soil moisture, which is, arguably not a big issue for, it's an issue for horticultural people, but it's a much bigger issue for grain growers and livestock producers. But this is the Bureau. The background image here is the Bureau's decile map of soil moisture down to a metre, really just showing how some of the potato country out here is atypically drier in their soil profile compared to normal. And we have one soil moisture probe there at Long Warrior, which is only 40% full, which is just literally amazing for that region for this time of the year. Up in the mountains, though, up in the Alps, particularly the Eastern Alps rather than the Goulburn Valley, thinking more Dartmouth, Hume, things, and Upper Murray, Cancoban, things really wet up there dramatically over this weekend. And so we're now at sort of decile 10 soil moisture, so atypically wet in some of those areas, and things are really starting to run off. Some of that volcanic potato country had been very dry, but is now wet up along the coast over here as well. If we look here at, this is how much available soil moisture there is, how full the profile is down to a metre. And if we're thinking about runoff, we need to be thinking about this black colour. This is the 95 to 100% full. And we can just see how the mountains north of the McAllister Valley catchment and the Murray and the Goulburn catchments, perhaps less so the Goulburn, but definitely the Murray catchments. There's a lot of the ranges there now really full, so that's great. And that rainfall from now on is likely to run off while that stays at saturation. But if we have a week or two where it's a bit drier, that might rapidly not be the case. So we need to keep that damp. Things are quite wet now down, as I said, on that southwest coast, close to 100% full or 100% full in a lot of areas, so starting to run off. But it's still much drier than normal out in this kind of area of the southwest. They'd be getting close to full normally at this time of the year, and there's a couple of probes here on crops nowhere near hort areas that aren't like that, but I'd be very unsurprised if those areas through here were not fairly similar. And even this area here shows up, Bacchus Marsh, Baliang is looking as dry as the Mallee in terms of their stored soil moisture. Just looking from space at how things are, really just showing the effect. This is greenness from space, and if you're the white colour, well, you're completely normal greenness at this time of the year. Really just showing this atypical area from Boundary Bend down to Boort that got an amazingly good rain on Anzac Day, 35 to 40 mil. And that now sticks out like the proverbial compared to everywhere else in the state, which is either browner than normal or close to normal. So I don't know if that means anything to the hort people there. A lot of the deciduous stuff wouldn't kind of matter. But there's probably a few veggies and things in there as well that sort of did get that greenness. But in terms of pests, there's probably things building up here that aren't kind of going on in most other areas. Let's move to climate now. This is the world's ocean temperature from a couple of days ago. The very warmest ocean is north of the Papua New Guinea and a little bit off the island of Sumatra at 30 degrees. The warmest ocean is along here because the sun is driving into the equator and warming that ocean up. If we look at this next image, this is a little animation of the moisture in the atmosphere, and you can see that the vast amount of moisture in the atmosphere in these orange and red colours is directly up above that warmer than normal water. The astute people will see that lake air is not evaporating any moisture off its surface remotely like what you see going on up here in the northern tropics. What's interesting is you'll see a westward movement from the east in this moisture coming off the Coral Sea, moving north. And what is surprising, I think, to a lot of people is that sometimes the rain that falls in Victoria has evaporated off the ocean up here. It's moved all the way across, and then it's got sucked down a northwest cloud band. And it's tempting to think that the moisture has come from the Indian Ocean, but that is not often the case. Often our frontal rain perhaps has come from the Indian Ocean, but you can see that frontal rain can derive out of the Atlantic, get caught in a front, come sweeping all the way through, and frontal rain, you're often not sure where it's ever come from. But tropical moisture, when we get more than 25 mil on the flatlands of Victoria, it's nearly always had to come from somewhere from the north. This is a little animation from the East Coast. Well, it wasn't an East Coast low, it was a cut-off low that formed and belted Gippsland at the start of this month. And you can just see the most amazing feed out of the Coral Sea coming through the Tasman Sea and driving into East Gippsland, which gave them some flooding, major flooding even there on the Mitchell River, which was uncalled for. But you can see just the most incredible moisture feed coming a long way down and in. The most recent low pressure that we had coming over the weekend, unfortunately, I couldn't get the animation. I was a bit late to get that, but this is just a screen grab of, I think, from Saturday. Might have been Friday or Saturday, from the low when it was sort of centered, not far around Renmark. But you can see that the feed into that was nothing like we saw before. There's no oranges coming through here. In fact, the feed into that low that we had, as good as that rain was, wasn't exciting. And what you can see is that moisture was coming through. Some of it did come out of the Indian Ocean, but a fair bit of it came out of the Arafura Sea up here in the central, and the moisture probably evaporated at some stage out in the Coral Sea. This is the most recent sea surface temperature map. There's been a few changes to this in the last couple of weeks, and we'll see why that is the case. The one thing that hasn't changed is that the ocean north of Australia is much, much warmer than normal. It's evaporating heaps of moisture up into the atmosphere, more than normal. And so there's nothing busted up here. If you can get the right trigger coming through, you can get an amazing rain. And we've seen that all summer, autumn, somewhere along the eastern coast and even in the interior of Australia. It's got amazing rainfall deriving their moisture out of this zone. It's just that much of Victoria, with the exception of East Gippsland, has not. We look in the central of the Pacific Ocean for evidence of El Nino or La Nina. And we start to see this sort of wavy pattern in the cold water here, which is the signature we always see at the start of a La Nina. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't guarantee that this continues on, but we always see this if one is going to form. And it's because, as we'll see soon, the trade winds have been blowing much stronger from east to west, and they're forming these little side eddies and the water sort of going colder. But it has been keeping that warmer water to the north of Australia. Those stronger winds have been holding there and pushing it there. The one thing that's really changed in the last week even is what's happened in the Indian Ocean. We've got warmer water in our box that we monitor here for the Indian Ocean dipole, but you can see that that warmer water is just broadly everywhere warmer than normal in the Eastern Indian Ocean. And the one thing that has happened reasonably rapidly in the last couple of weeks is that the water off the coast of Africa is, I'll say, normalised. It's quite, there's areas of colder, areas of average, a little bit of warmer in the corner here, but things have backed off dramatically there from what they were a 2 months ago, which was exceptionally warm off the coast of Africa. Now, if we're to get a negative Indian Ocean dipole, we need to see at least normal water off here, preferably cooler, and we need to see warmer water off Indonesia. But classically, with a negative IOD, we'd be seeing the warmest water right here against the island of Sumatra and sort of ever concentric moons of warmer water coming out, and not this kind of pattern of just warm everywhere. So what's just happened is that the dipole mode index, which measures the Indian Ocean dipole, has gone to a negative IOD-like value on the basis that this box here is much warmer than this box here. But in terms of an actual negative IOD pattern, that's not convincing there at the moment. So it's early days, but it's at least moving in the right direction if you were wanting to see a negative Indian Ocean dipole. The Central Pacific here is just negative 0.26. It's a little bit cooler. You know, we need to get to negative 0.8 for something like La Nina. Just briefly looking at the undersea temperatures of the ocean. This is a cross-section along the equator. The continents are in the grey areas and the ocean has got the colours. And looking in the Pacific Ocean, we can see this massive amount of warmer than normal water to depth in the Western Pacific Ocean. It's been there for more than 4 more years now, with various La Nina attempts or not happening, and an El Nino attempt in 2023 that didn't manage to stir that up. So in terms of a pre-La Nina-like signature, this is not very convincing. This would normally be much colder to depth underneath here if we really had a strong La Nina-like pattern there occurring in the undersea. The other thing that's a bit weird is just the undersea of the Indian Ocean doesn't really look very negative IOD-like either, which would be normally sort of cooler water on this side, warmer water over here and cooler water over here. We really see the cool water in the central Indian Ocean and a bit kind of warmer either side of that. So it's not really a convincing pattern in any of those undersea signatures for either negative IOD or La Nina. This is cloud over the last 30 days. We look at the junction of the dateline and the equator. There's nothing going on there. It's normal. We do, however, see an abundance of cloud, more than normal in tropical Australia or more tropical Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. And that is a La Nina-like signature, but it isn't because of a La Nina. It's just really the effect of that really warm water that's up there. If we look out in the Indian Ocean, if we had a negative IOD and it was coupling with the atmosphere, we'd be seeing a really strong eye of blue colours here with greater cloud off the island of Sumatra and a lack of cloud off Africa, and we simply don't see that at the moment. What we have seen is some northwest cloud band activity, not coming into Victoria, but there's been greater northwest cloud band activity coming through WA and into SA, and long may we see a bit more of that going on. What we see happening over the weekend was the very first northwest cloud band that we'd seen into Victoria for the season. People may not know that the negative Indian Ocean dipole, if one actually formed, is often the best known giver of the northwest cloud bands. Really tends to accentuate them if we were to actually get one going on. And this is what's been causing these changes, is the wind speeds and directions. So this is the last 30 days, and we've had increased easterly trade winds, which blow from east to west, but they've really started to crank up stronger in the central Pacific, which is why we've seen that cooling at the surface, because water here has been shifted to over here and it's upwelled from the surface cooler. And we'll be seeing the warmer water pool pooling up to the north of Australia. And in the Indian Ocean, we're seeing the opposite. Normally the winds are blowing from east to west in the Indian Ocean, but we've seen some stronger westerly wind into Sumatra, which is kind of a bit more atypical, but it's what we need to see if we get to get the formation of a negative IOD. And I think that's probably why we've seen that change in the ocean going on this month as well. The problem is, if we look just right now, that those westerly winds have returned to normal and the easterly winds have returned to normal in the Pacific Ocean. So these have been sort of bursts of activity rather than sort of something locking in and guarantee that these events might actually occur. So we need to see, if we're going to see any La Nina, we need to see some much stronger easterly wind happening. And if the negative IOD is to sort of start forming itself and cementing itself in terms of its activity, well, we need to see some much stronger westerly wind driving into Sumatra, which is classic for those events. Very briefly, looking at frontal systems spinning around Antarctica, the southern annular mode has spent the first half of July in a very strong positive phase, which is pulling the fronts away from Victoria. Then we had a burst of negativity. Now we're sitting stock standard normal, but this is the American Bureau, but the Australian Bureau model also predicts a burst of positivity in the coming fortnight, which would be pulling things further south and leaving to a bit less frontal activity if that is to occur. And that's what normally we'd expect. A positive southern annular mode is less useful for frontal rainfall, particularly south of the divide. Pressure has been playing good things for us. You can see there is no high pressure sitting over Australia, which is incredibly unusual. It's sitting off WA. The centre of higher pressure is sitting at the South Australian Northern Territory border, which is much higher up than normal, which is meaning that frontal systems have had unimpeded sweeping through, even though the first half of the month, the southern annular mode was trying to drag them down. The other thing is that in terms of absolute pressure, we've had much lower than normal pressure over whole of Australia, and particularly over Victoria. There's been so many low pressure systems, cut-off lows sweeping through, and frontal systems for that matter. And any time we have lower than normal pressure in winter, if that was to average out, we'd expect to be having higher rainfall. So we'll see if that stays the same way. It's a good sign. We've seen some lower pressure in the tropics as well, which makes it easier to get moisture down here as well. In terms of the Southern Oscillation Index and the pressure that we see for La Nina, there's kind of nothing going on there at the moment. There's kind of been a disturbance here south of Tahiti, which is kind of mucking things up. We'd expect higher pressure at Tahiti, lower at Darwin if we do have a La Nina, but we'd expect a whole lot of other things to go on as well, which currently we don't see going. So looking at predictions now for the next 3 months, these are the most recent ones. Model skill is about as good as it gets for this time of the year, or accuracy. We have 3 models predicting some sort of La Nina, but by no means a consensus. But we do have a strong consensus for a negative IOD of some kind from the majority of models. And unsurprisingly, we have a lot of forecasts for wetter conditions in the next 3 months, not from all models, but certainly from a majority. What's interesting is that the Bureau's model is not one of those. They've got a much wetter signal in New South Wales and for northern Victoria, the Mallee and far eastern Victoria, but a more neutral pattern. They've even got a drier sniff for August. And that has a very signature of a positive southern annular mode on it. But a lot of other models have got these wetter signals, but you will see that they're predicated on a negative IOD being in existence most of the time. So if we don't get a proper negative IOD, my confidence in these wetter forecasts is nowhere near as good. The other thing you see is there's no shortage of warmer forecasts for the next 3 months as well, which could well and truly bring bud burst and thing a bit quicker on. The real crystal ball gazing out to 4 and 6 months into early summer or summer, which is not worth 2/5 of much at this time of the year or looking that far ahead. We've got 4 La Niñas here. Most of them keep the negative IOD. Well, they kick that away because we'd expect that to die in November if one actually formed. But we see a lot of wetter signals from the models continuing. I just suspect that warm ocean is going to stay up there to the north of Australia with the sort of conditions we kind of see even at the moment without a La Niña or a negative IOD. And the warmer conditions continue as well. So I think this is my last slide, Amy. Just in summation, in terms of a negative IOD, I want to see 5 blue ticks here. And we've got a couple partially, sea surface, ocean depth, the pressure, the winds, the cloud. And we don't see much going on over in the La Niña either. There's no solid blue ticks on any of these things here either. So we're just at the start of something potentially happening, but it's very early days yet. And there's no guarantees that that negative IOD will form and do its thing. There's some chances for La Niña, but I'm even less convinced about that. The predictions are for wetter, but there are sniffs of neutral there, which means anything could happen. And I note the Bureau's model itself, which has had some good skill, looking out that 1 month out, has got a bit of a drier thing about it for August. Not strongly, but it's not the direction you'd want it to be going if you're looking for extra rain. But those warmer temperatures are very solid for the next 6 months. So that's it from me, Amy. If you want to take a snap of a QR code here, you can subscribe to our newsletter or get our monthly YouTube that comes out, basically summing everything I've just talked about in the last 25 minutes into less than 5 minutes, which may be more palatable for people, Amy.